favorite, Wilson Alexander, who's here with us every Tuesday, checking back in this morning. Wilson, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, y'all. Doing well. How are you guys?
Doing great, man. Wrap it up. How was the Big Apple?
It was awesome. I mean, it was Jaden Daniels' first trip to New York. It was only my second, so it was really fun. But it was really just surreal kind of seeing, like you said, an LSU quarterback for the second time in 5 years win the Heisman, and everything that Jaden Daniels had worked toward come to fruition, and this sort of culmination of all this stuff that he had done really since last year. I mean, over the course of his entire life, really. It's not just necessarily a one-season thing that happens. But, he comes back last year and decides he wants to come back to LSU and doesn't want to be the same quarterback. And to go out and do all of this was just incredible. It was really watching him kind of throughout the weekend embrace it. He wasn't necessarily uncomfortable with any of it. Jaden's, as we all know, kind of quiet, a little bit more quiet. He's not necessarily brash and boisterous or anything, but just sort of trying to take it all in every step of the way was really enjoyable, having gotten to cover him on a daily basis for the last 2 years and see all the work that he put in really pay off.
It's been amazing to see the hype machine of LSU go into overdrive once again. Wilson, to see it in 2019 was kind of surreal, to watch the country fall in love with that 2019 team a lot, for how they were performing on the field, but really moreover because of the relationship that people were forming with them through social media and through, the media that the school was putting out. What did you make of the campaign that LSU put on for Daniels, and ultimately how much of a difference do you believe that made in this race? I mean, Burrow was a runaway in 19. They could have, really kind of hid themselves and he still would have won the award. How much did putting Daniels out front for the last 5 weeks of the season matter?
It's hard to say exactly and quantify, what kind of a difference it made, but it certainly didn't hurt anything. I mean, LSU, as you said, and as everybody saw, did such a good job of sharing Jaden's stats in particular, and just putting out there basically his case for the award. And that started, really kind of in the middle of October, when they started formulating what their plan was going to be. And then they got him in on the bye week to do a lot of the work that we ended up seeing kind of from the Florida game on in particular. That was all sort of coming together on the bye week in terms of the interviews that he did, filming him in the XR studio that is on LSU's campus to create some of the content that they had. And then, just continuing to push that out with, the website. And it was interesting, in 2019, the media landscape has changed. And so LSU did a 10,000 word story on Burrow and a 4-part video series. This year it was a little bit different, where they didn't do that big long story on Jaden or anything like that, but they had the 4-part video series kind of telling his life, and then the website with all of his statistics, and really trying to harness what is a kind of a different media landscape than even it was in 2019. And they did a good job, I think, in terms of getting all of that information out and doing it consistently, drumming up interest in especially with a billboard on the day of the Pac-12 championship game. It got people talking, and obviously it was probably more so what Jaden did on the field and what happened with the Pac-12 championship game with Oregon losing that seemed to kind of solidify things for Jaden. But it didn't hurt what LSU did to campaign for him, and they really should. They really did a good job, and I think a lot of people recognize that.
Do you expect to see him again in purple and gold?
Yeah, I would be surprised if he plays in the bowl game, just because, what do you really have to gain from playing against the 7-5 unranked Wisconsin team when you've already elevated your draft stock to possible first round status, maybe even possible top 5 pick status, depending on, that's got a good ways to go here, but between now and the draft. But he's really turned a lot of heads in the NFL world this year. And so I would be surprised if he plays. But he hasn't said one way or another yet. And so, got to wait to kind of hear what Jaden is going to do in that regard. I mean, all weekend he was kind of asked about it here and there once when he was doing the stuff at Raising Cane's. Again, even after the award, after winning it itself, he was asked if that would impact his decision to play in the bowl. He just kind of smiled and said, "We'll see." He's trying to enjoy the moment. And so he was artfully and respectfully dodging that all weekend. He kept saying that he was going to talk to his family and make a decision. So I'd expect that to come sooner rather than later, because LSU started bowl practice yesterday.
Wilson, what do you make of what happened to Malik Neighbors? You called it last week. We asked you directly with Marvin Harrison getting the invite to Manhattan. Does that mean that he's going to be the the Bolitnikoff, and you straight up said you believe so, and we agreed. And then to watch it happen Friday night was still a punch, I thought, and it felt very. My heart went out to Malik Neighbors in that moment, and still, know that has to have residual effect. What do you make of what happened to him, and will there be any fallout? Because I have heard since that the process maybe should be examined this offseason in award voting in college football, because it feels like lifetime achievements rather than individual yearly awards.
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing too much change in the process come just as a result of this, because there's been these kinds of situations before. It just seems that this year LSU fans and really got behind Malik so much that it made a little bit more noise. And it may be also because we're seeing that on a local level. It stood out more to us than maybe it has in the past. People not winning something, and even if they're very deserving. And as we've all said, Marvin Harrison is a fantastic player, but Malik had such a strong statistical season that it certainly was, it was disappointing for him more than anybody else. And, I think he was pretty torn up about it. As I think we talked about last week, he had a picture of the Bolitnikoff trophy on his weight rack, and he looked at it every single day from throughout the offseason, because he was talked to Jake Flint back in January. Jake was asking, the strength coach, all of their goals, and one of Malik's was to win the Bolitnikoff. And so Jake Flint put that picture of the trophy on his weight rack as something for him to look at every single day and fuel him. And that was something he really wanted. And he said about it, "I ain't say no finalist, I said winner." And so it was something that is certainly, maybe something he'll have to try to turn into more motivation as he starts to head into, most likely his NFL career, because we saw also his tweet about it saying he's going to remember that. He was certainly upset, and especially because Marvin Harrison, he only won by one vote, and it was that close.
Wilson Alexander joining us from The Advocate. Wilson, with bowl preparation beginning yesterday and getting out on the practice field, Brian Kelly really acknowledging it, but how important are these practices really for, beyond Daniels, Neighbors, and the headliners here? What is the true advantage of these plus 15 practices that LSU gets?
Well, it's particularly for the guys who haven't played a whole lot this year, and anybody who's coming back next season to get further development. If someone's coming, I think of someone like a Mason Smith, even, who has played a lot this year, but can just use more and more practice coming off those injuries, not quite having maybe the season that he expected to have or was expected to have. But also a lot of the young guys, just getting them and into more reps and kind of figuring out what you have going into spring practice next year. Shelton Sampson comes to mind, and maybe a Kylan Jackson, really see what you have maybe a little bit more with him, because he was injured for most of the year. Really all those freshman receivers and Troy Holly and Caleb Jackson, and maybe some, Kamorian Pimpton, a lot of the freshmen and the guys who didn't play in particular, you're able to get to a better sense, these coaches do, of what these guys have. And maybe we'll end up being able to see more of them in the bowl game too. But even if we don't, they at least are able to get 15 practices in that are good for their development. And that's a big bonus when you start going into next season and you start to think about and look at all of the ways that this roster is going to change and who's going to be needed to be counted on. That stuff kind of really starts in bowl prep. Especially because these bowls aren't as significant maybe as they used to be in terms of just the game itself. It's more of an exhibition, and really it's more of almost a preview in some ways of 2024. And you can start to look ahead a little bit more, and that's an advantage for sure.
Wilson, from the younger player's standpoint, as you mentioned, what did you make of Quincy Wiggins putting his name into the transfer portal?
Yeah, that was a shame, I think, for LSU to lose out on lose somebody who physically and athletically is as gifted as Quincy is. But it was also maybe not necessarily a total shock when you start to look at where he was on the roster and the fact that he'd only played in 9 games over 2 seasons. Ahead of him at that defensive end position, you got Savion Jones most likely coming back. And then, Paris Shand emerged this year as his backup and as a role and situational player who had a pretty solid season and certainly flashed at times. And then, you got Deshaun Womack behind him. And even though Deshaun's someone who kind of go defensive end and jack as well. And, he's in the mix. And so there's just a lot. And then they signed, obviously they just got Gabe Relaford committed, and Gabe Relaford's a defensive end too. And so it just feels like maybe this was, if you're just kind of looking at it, anyway, from my perspective anyway, it looked like Quincy was probably looking at the depth chart and realizing like he's starting to get squeezed a little bit. And, it's certainly a shame because, that's somebody who has a lot of athletic talent, like we said, but maybe he can go for somewhere where he can maybe continue to get developed a little bit more and have that talent brought out of him and start to get some more playing time because it seemed like it wasn't coming here with only 9 games played over the last 2 years. I mean, we barely got to see much of him at all.
Yeah, a trip to Houston, a visit to Houston for Quincy Wiggins after going into the portal may seem like a good fit for him. Wilson, when you look at this bowl preparation and you look at the younger guys as well, anticipate any other names as far as the portal goes or any surprises for you up to this point as far as the portal is concerned?
No surprises up to this point because it's like everybody who's is entered is basically someone who is further down the depth chart and going somewhere for playing time. Like you look at Marlon Martinez, who entered, I think it was the same day as Quincy, right, on Friday. That's somebody who, certainly had a role on this offensive line as a veteran backup, but with 1 year of eligibility remaining, needed to go somewhere and play because he probably wasn't going to play here after not getting a starting job this season. And with everything that LSU's bringing back on the offensive line and all the guys it's continuing to bring in with what Brad Davis is doing there in recruiting. And so everybody, it's like guys like that and LaTerrence Welch who, maybe if he stuck around, he could have earned a role, but he hadn't yet. And so it makes sense to, go and transfer to Arizona State like he is. And, other guys like that get a fresh start somewhere. And so no surprises yet because it's everybody who's transferred. It's clearly like trying to find playing time. I would certainly expect there to be more transfers. That's just kind of the nature of how it goes. Who those specifically are, I don't have a firm idea necessarily, but probably I would be surprised if it's big stars, guys on the 2 deep who do that. Probably guys like this who can continually are for a little bit further down the depth chart. Obviously, some of these guys like Marlon was on the 2 deep and that kind of thing, but next season might not have been, and so this hasn't been any surprises really yet, and it'll probably continue to be guys like that, and we'll see kind of what the final number ends up being.
Brian Kelly said last week when he was meeting with the press, over the last 3 weeks, it's been evaluation. There was exit interviews with the players 2 weeks ago. Last week it was recruiting. This week it was evaluating on the field and some coaches. What do you anticipate he's saying, and is there a timeline that you believe he's operating under? If so, what is it for making some changes?
It's his timeline and his timeline alone. And it's I think it's something that really only he knows and is going to kind of just operate as he wants to and sees fit. And I think that's kind of the thing that's going on here. We're all expecting there to be changes of some kind, but it's going to be up to Brian Kelly ultimately as to when those are made. And he's been kind of moving the goalposts around. When we talked last Tuesday, he was about to have a press conference. It seemed like, okay, hey, maybe we can get some answers here. And he gave some passionate responses, but never gave any hint to what he was thinking whatsoever. And even trying to the only maybe hint that we got was when he gave the answer about how he had Brian Van Gorder at Notre Dame in 2016 after 4 games and saying how if this was that easy being one person who he thought was the problem, he could have made a change. He doesn't think it's just one person who is the issue from the sound of it, that being Matt House. And so it's a little bit more complex from the way Brian Kelly talks about it. And so, we'll see kind of how this ends. It sounds like he wants to get through recruiting first. As he said that they're going to be out on the road, and he said these coaches still have responsibilities to LSU, which was an interesting use of phrase. And so maybe once they get through recruiting here this weekend and the dead period kicks in and then signing day hits, then maybe we'll start to see some movement. It feels like that might be maybe the timeline, but Brian Kelly is the only one who I think really truly knows kind of what timeline this stuff is going to happen on, because it's ultimately up to him as to what he wants to do and when he wants to do it.
Last one, Wilson, I'll get you out of here. You mentioned recruiting. They land Relaford last week, and then they go in-house to Dominic McKinley tomorrow. What's the possibility that they could close here and land the top 2 defensive linemen in the state?
Well, we'll see. Dominic McKinley, from as far as I know, didn't back on campus much at all this fall, if at all. And so they I think got a further way to go with trying to flip him than they did maybe with Relaford. who seemed to look, there was more buzz around Relaford for a little bit while longer than there has been about McKinley, who seems like he's been a little bit more solid to Texas A&M. But this is certainly, we've seen a lot of movement on Texas A&M's defensive line all the way from top to bottom and into recruiting, of course, with LSU even flipping Relaford. And so it's maybe not out of the complete realm of possibility. We'll see, especially when you're talking about an in-state guy. And gosh, would that be significant if LSU could get him, not only just being the number one player in the state, but at a position that LSU really needs to build at with defensive tackles. And so that would be huge if LSU can somehow make a late push here and flip him down the stretch, or at least get him to think a little bit longer. Because it hurt at the time for LSU when he went out of state, even though it wasn't a shocker necessarily at the time that he committed, because that seemed to be where he was leaning, was going somewhere else. But if they can get him to change his mind and come on back in, Jimmy Lindsey's been out recruiting, and so maybe he can make a little bit more of a difference here now that he's back and healthy and recovered from his condition. So maybe that would be huge if LSU could end up doing it.
Wilson Alexander from the Advocate and NOLA.com. Follow him on social media at WHAlexander_. Wilson, thank you, man. We'll talk to you next week.
Wilson, did you get that pizza?
Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.
Did you get the pizza, Wilson?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the
New York slice?
Yeah. Did you get your New York slice?
The great reference.
I unfortunately didn't, because it was closed. But I know. But I saw it and I was like, oh, yes. And then I walked over there and it looked like there was nothing happening. But I still had to get the picture at least. I love The Office, and so that was one of the highlights of the trip.
It might be a New York landmark. The
If it's not, then it should be.
Yes.
Later, buddy.
Yeah, that's great. See y'all.
There he is, Wilson Alexander, checking in from NOLA.com and The Advocate.